This presentation is on behalf of ATA, the Australian Teachers Alliance. Australia is a huge country with vast distances between some of the branches, so we often feel very isolated. So it was decided about 30 years ago to form a special association for the teachers. The committee that has run this for the last 3 years has been the teachers from the Hunter Valley branch. The Hunter Valley branch is based in Newcastle and it runs everything in New South Wales from Gosford up to the Queensland border, an area several times the size of the UK. And our experiences this year have been typical of the experiences of most groups throughout Australia. We managed to start more or less as normal in February, that's the beginning of our dancing season. Obviously, there were all sorts of special regulations about signing into the class, hand sanitising, cleaning, etc. And we teachers also tried to do dances which had little giving of hands, and in fact ATA published a list of RSCDS dances that could be done with minimal giving of hands. We managed to run an opening social with our chairperson of the branch and of ATA, Marnie Wilson, running it. We also had a day of dance, and then we had to close down, and we've remained closed for the rest of the year, like most of the rest of Australia. Much further south from us, in Badalla, my correspondent, Janine Holden, reports how important the Zoom lessons from the RSCDS were, and this actually is repeated by quite a few of the correspondents. She said that for a while last year they were able to dance in the hall, but then that was no longer allowed. But you were allowed to invite 5 people to your home, so she invited 5 dancers, and along with her husband, that made 6, so they had a set. She had the idea of using the TV, and they would watch formations on that or the dances on that. If they learnt a new dance from the screen, they then danced it along with the dancers on the screen. She said it felt like there were 2 sets in the house. Further west from there, in Canberra, things were even worse because they were due to run the annual Australian Winter School last year. Of course, that got cancelled. This year, they thought they would just run a weekend school at the end of September, and that got cancelled too. Australia is a very large country, and we do have teachers in every state. There were 3 areas that teachers didn't respond with any reports, and I wasn't really very surprised about that. Those areas were Western Australia, Northern Territory and Tasmania, and these 3 areas closed themselves off from international travels and travellers from the rest of Australia, unless under strict quarantine conditions and rules, and they remained COVID-0 for quite a bit of the time, so they only had occasional lockdowns, so their dancing has continued as normal. The other areas, it has been quite a different story. The branch in Adelaide, which is the capital of South Australia, ran several things at the beginning of the year, one of which was a come and try night, which looks from the photographs as though it was a great success. They also managed to run a couple of socials, and Neville Pope, my correspondent from down there, said that if you don't plan it, it won't happen. So they planned in spite of COVID. Of course, like most of the rest of us, they had to close down for the second half of the year. Queensland branch had a series of lockdowns, and dancing was stopped for a time, and they tackled this by publishing the Corona Chronicle. And this was a great little magazine. It had some wonderful cartoons about COVID, and it had all sorts of other articles as well, cookery ones, ones about plants, general interest ones, and so on. So it was greatly looked forward to. Here's another of the cartoons, and I think we really must thank the editorial committee of Kathy, Lynn and Fran for keeping us so amused during COVID lockdowns with these things. The thing that I particularly liked from them was that they would publish a series of links to songs about the virus, some of which of course were wonderful parodies. I also like the fact that Kathy McLeod, our correspondent, did a virtual class most weeks, and it was based around a theme, and all the dances had a video link to the dances that were mentioned. And this followed on from their very first experience of lockdown with their opening social in 2020, when they had to cancel the social. And what they did instead was send out video links to the dances so people could still enjoy them. Melbourne, the capital city of Victoria, has the unhappy record of being the city in the world that has had the longest number of lockdown days. Christine Freeman, our correspondent from there, talks about how early in the season they managed to run a branch opening social, day of dance, and even a beginner's course with 25 attendees. Once they've had a whole series of lockdowns, they then tried to keep in touch with Zoom meetings, online classes and newsletters and so on. One of the classes within Melbourne, Ringwood, the teacher there, Sarah Wrigley, wrote a dance. She had been joining in Zoom classes with a place in New Zealand called Kayiwaka, and she wrote a dance in their honour which has no giving of hands at all. She also talks about the fact that she kept the class going with monthly newsletters, fortnightly Zoom classes, and also the class took part in a virtual Highland Games. It's well worth watching. Look up Ringwood Highland Games. Sydney, which is the capital of New South Wales, has a branch, and like most of the rest of us in 2020, they had to close down. But in the second half of the year, Diana Hasty, one of my correspondents from there, ran a step class, which was very successful. This year, they managed to run a day of dance in March to sort of introduce people back to dancing, and an easy dance social in May. Of course, these were complete with all the regulations and COVID marshals and all the other regulations as well. The other correspondent from Sydney, Trish Nichols, has prepared her own presentation on the travails of trying to run a candidates class in the middle of lockdowns.
In the Australian summer of January 2020, the Sydney Unit 5 candidates were all on track completing Unit 4, heading towards Unit 5 and the examination tour in November 2021. Then came the pandemic. At first we met via Zoom monthly. Candidates were asked to analyse and submit lesson plans for dancers on the Unit 5 list. These were then discussed as a group. When our government eased restrictions a little to allow 5 visitors to someone's house, we met to do a session on step faults and improvement exercises and another one on rhythmic coaching. By August, the government allowed 10 people to exercise, so we arranged a few training sessions. At these sessions, the volunteers were required to wear masks, dance with ghosts, and not use any hands. Then, by October, the restrictions were eased a little more and we were allowed to exercise with 20 people, so we increased the number of volunteers. Again, at first not using hands, and then at each dancer's discretion as to whether they wanted to wear a mask or not. No other clubs in Sydney were dancing at this stage, so these were very special sessions for the Sydney dancers. Our dancing year finishes in December and begins usually in February. However, at the beginning of 2021, with no vaccine program in sight and people still nervous about the virus circulating in the community, most clubs didn't begin dancing until March. We danced from March until June. The candidates managed to have their first Unit 5 training session, And then we were in lockdown by July, and it became clear we couldn't hold our exam in November, and we were very disappointed. So back to Zoom for a couple more learning sessions, and then another creative idea to keep the candidates engaged. We decided to hold mini fitness sessions, and hopefully you'll be able to read about these in the next Scottish Country Dancer magazine next year. We were absolutely delighted when Lorna Ogilvie joined us for our last session. As of today, we are just recently out of 107 days of lockdown number 2 and hoping with fingers crossed we can hold our exam in April next year. Thank you everyone for listening.